While driving me to my wedding, my best friend said, "Your mother paid me to stay away from you." I turned to look at Oliver, who was gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white, while my wedding dress took up most of the car, and we were 20 minutes from the church where 200 guests were waiting. "She paid you?" He kept his eyes on the road, but I could see his jaw clenching. $5,000 when we were 18. Another $10,000 when we graduated from college. $20,000 when you got engaged to Richard. My hands started shaking, and I grabbed the door handle like I might jump out. "You took money to reject me?" Oliver finally looked at me, and his eyes were red. "She said if I didn't take it and stay away, she'd destroy my father's business. He had just started his plumbing company, and your mother held the commercial lease. She could have ruined us with one phone call." I thought about all the times I'd cried to him about feeling unlovable when he rejected me after prom. All the nights I'd wondered what was wrong with me that my best friend since kindergarten couldn't see me as more. "You loved me back?" My voice cracked, and Oliver pulled into a gas station parking lot. "I've loved you since we were 7. And you shared your lunch with me because my family couldn't afford to pay for school meals. But your mother came to me the day before I was going to ask you to the prom. She said you deserved better than a plumber's son." I felt sick thinking about my mother helping me pick out my prom dress while knowing she'd already paid Oliver to reject me. "She said if I ever told you, she'd sue my family for extortion and we couldn't afford lawyers." My phone started buzzing with texts from my mother asking where I was. She picked Richard for me. Said he was from a good family with the right connections. Oliver nodded. "She brought him to that fundraiser specifically to meet you. Told everyone you were single and looking for someone appropriate. She knew I'd be there working as part of the catering staff. Made sure I had to serve drinks to you and Richard all night while you flirted." I remembered that night. Oliver had seemed so cold and distant. "I thought you didn't care. I thought you were happy for me." He turned off the car engine. "Happy?" I went home and punched a hole in my wall. My dad asked what was wrong, and I couldn't even tell him because your mother had us both trapped. She owned the building his business operated. One word from her, and we'd lose everything. The wedding was supposed to start in 15 minutes. "Why are you telling me now?" Oliver looked at me in my wedding dress that cost more than his family made in 6 months. "Because your mother made a mistake. She got greedy. She came to me last week with a contract. $50,000 to move to another state after your wedding. She wanted me gone permanently, but she put it in writing this time. All of it. The payments, the threats, the plan to separate us." He pulled out a folded document from his pocket. "She was so confident I'd sign it, she admitted everything. How she'd been planning this since we were kids. How did she know we'd end up together if she didn't intervene? How you weren't allowed to marry beneath your social status." I read the contract, and there it was in black and white. My mother's signature. Her terms. She admitted manipulation of my entire romantic life. She even brags in the contract about how she successfully matched you with Richard. Says his family's connection to the governor will help your father's business, and that's worth more than your happiness. My phone rang, and it was Richard. "Where are you?" "Your mother is going crazy. The ceremony is starting." I hung up without answering. She stole my life. She stole our life. Oliver nodded. "She stole 12 years from us. We could have been married by now. Could have had kids. Instead, you're about to marry someone you don't love because your mother decided I wasn't rich enough." I thought about Richard, who was nice enough but for whom I felt nothing, who my mother had pushed on me relentlessly, who'd proposed in front of both our families at a restaurant my mother had chosen. "Drive." Oliver looked confused. "Where?" "The church is that way." I pulled off my veil and threw it in the back seat. "I don't care where. Just drive." We drove for 3 hours while my phone exploded with calls and texts. My mother, Richard, the wedding planner, the priest. 200 guests were wondering where the bride was. Finally, my mother's text came through. "If you don't come back right now, I'm cutting you off. No inheritance, no trust fund, nothing." I showed Oliver, and he pulled over again. "I can't let you lose everything for me. I'm still just a plumber's son. I can't give you the life you're used to." I looked at him and realized my mother had won, even if I knew the truth. She'd made him believe he was worthless. What life? The life where my mother controls everything? Where does she pick my husband, like she's breeding horses? Where does she pay people to reject me? He was quiet for a long time. "I make $40,000 a year. Your wedding dress costs more than that." I started laughing and couldn't stop. This dress that I didn't even pick? That my mother chose because Richard's mother would approve? You think I care about this dress? I grabbed the zipper and pulled it down, stepping out of the dress right there on the side of the highway in my slip. There. Now it's not worth more than your salary. Oliver pulled the car back onto the highway, and I sat there in my slip with that expensive wedding dress crumpled in the back seat like something I'd thrown away after a bad party. My phone kept buzzing in my purse, and I could feel each vibration like a small electric shock. But I couldn't make myself look because my hands were shaking too hard, and I kept thinking about 12 years of payments and threats and lies. The highway stretched out in front of us, and Oliver drove with both hands gripped on the wheel, and neither of us said anything because what was there to say after finding out your whole life was a setup? We passed exit signs and rest stops and other cars full of people having normal Saturday afternoons while I sat there in my underwear running away from my own wedding. My phone buzzed again, and I finally pulled it out to turn it off, but the screen lit up with notifications and I couldn't stop myself from looking. 73 missed calls, 46 text messages, 3 voicemails. My mother's name showed up over and over between Richard's texts and the wedding planner's messages, and even the priest had called twice. Oliver pulled into a rest stop without asking, and parked in a spot far away from the other cars. He got out and walked over to a bench near some trees, and I followed him because I didn't know what else to do. I sat down next to him and started reading through the messages. My mother's texts went from concerned to angry to threatening in the span of 20 minutes. Richard's messages were confused and hurt, asking where I was and if I was okay. The wedding planner was having a breakdown about 200 guests sitting in a church waiting for a bride who wasn't coming. I scrolled through them all and felt sick reading about the chaos I'd caused by just driving away. Oliver sat close enough that our arms almost touched, but he didn't try to hug me or tell me it would be okay, and somehow that made me feel less alone than any comfort would have. I needed to call Richard, because whatever else was true, he didn't deserve to be left waiting at a church without knowing why. I dialed his number and he answered on the first ring. I told him I couldn't marry him, and the words came out shaky but clear. He asked why, and I said I just found out my mother paid my best friend to stay away from me for 12 years, and I never loved Richard the way I should love someone I was marrying. The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then Richard said he'd suspected I didn't love him, but his parents had pushed so hard for the marriage because of the business connections between our families. He said he'd been going along with it because that's what everyone expected, and now we were both realizing we'd been pieces in a game our parents were playing. I told him I was sorry for doing it this way, and he said he understood, and that maybe we were both better off. We hung up, and I sat there holding my phone thinking about how Richard had known, and I'd known, but we'd both been walking toward that altar anyway. Oliver pulled out the contract from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. I read through every word of my mother's admissions about manipulating my romantic life since we were teenagers. She'd written that she successfully matched me with Richard for his family's political connections. She'd written that she knew early intervention was necessary to prevent me from making mistakes with Oliver. She'd written that paying Oliver $50,000 to leave the state permanently would ensure the investment in this marriage paid dividends. The clinical language made my stomach turn, because she'd written about my life like I was a business deal she was closing. She'd actually used the word investment to describe my marriage. I read the contract 3 times trying to understand how my mother could think this was okay. Oliver watched me read, and I could see he was waiting for my reaction. I asked him where we could go now, and he looked confused like he hadn't thought past getting me away from the church. I realized I had nowhere to go because every property and connection and resource in my life traced back to my mother's money and control. My apartment was in a building my parents owned. My car was registered in my mother's name. My credit cards were connected to accounts she monitored. Even my gym membership and country club access came through family connections. So Oliver said I could stay at his apartment, and I almost laughed because he was literally the only person in my life my mother didn't own. It was funny in a horrible way that she'd spent 12 years trying to buy him off, and now he was the only safe place I had. We got back in the car and drove for another 30 minutes until Oliver pulled up in front of an old building with a hardware store on the ground floor. He said his apartment was upstairs, and we climbed a narrow staircase that smelled like paint and sawdust. The apartment was smaller than my walk-in closet at my mother's house. One main room with a kitchen area in the corner and a bathroom I could see through an open door, and a bedroom that was barely big enough for a bed. But it felt safe in a way nowhere else had felt in hours. Oliver gave me an old college sweatshirt and sweatpants from his dresser, and I changed in the bathroom. The clothes were too big and hung off me, but they were soft and comfortable, and for the first time all day, I could breathe normally. My phone started ringing, and I knew without looking it was my mother. I answered because she wouldn't stop calling until I did. She started yelling before I could say anything about how I needed to come back right now and fix this mess I'd created. I told her I knew about the payments to Oliver and the contract. The line went silent. Then she said everything she'd done was to protect me from making a mistake that would ruin my life. She said Oliver was never good enough for our family, and I deserved better than a plumber's son. I felt something break inside me hearing her say that. I told her she didn't protect me, she controlled me. I told her I'd rather have nothing than live one more day under her control. She laughed and said I had no idea what nothing actually meant. She said I'd never worked a real day in my life, and I'd come crawling back within a week when I realized what I'd given up. She was yelling loud enough that Oliver could hear her from across the room. I hung up on her and sat down on Oliver's couch. The reality of what I'd done started hitting me in waves. I had $200 in my purse. No car because I'd left it at the church. No clothes except what I was wearing. No job that wasn't connected to my father's company where my mother had influence. I'd just walked away from everything. Oliver sat down next to me and said I could stay as long as I needed. But I could see the worry in his eyes because his apartment was barely big enough for one person, and he made $40,000 a year. We ordered pizza because neither of us had eaten since breakfast. We sat on his couch eating straight from the box, and the reality of what we'd done settled over us like dust. Oliver said he was scared my mother would follow through on her old threats about his father's business. I realized that even in choosing freedom, we were both still afraid of her power. I woke up on Oliver's couch the next morning with my neck stiff and my phone screen showing 17 new messages. The legal notice from my mother's lawyer sat at the top of the list with a subject line that made my stomach drop. I opened it and read the formal language stating I was officially cut off from all family money, my trust fund access was revoked, and I had 30 days to remove my belongings from the family home. Oliver came out of his bedroom in work clothes and started making coffee without saying anything. I showed him the email, and we sat at his tiny kitchen table reading through every line of the legal notice. The finality of it made my chest tight with panic and relief mixing together in a way that felt confusing and overwhelming. Oliver poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and said we'd figure it out. I stared at the words on my phone screen and realized my mother had actually done it. She'd cut me off completely. I thought about calling someone, but everyone I knew was connected to my mother somehow. Then I remembered Ryan from college. My mother had pushed me away from her after graduation, always suggesting other friends who came from better families. I found Ryan's number in my old contacts and called before I could change my mind. She answered on the 3rd ring and I started explaining what happened, but she interrupted me. She said she'd been wondering when I'd finally figure out what my mother was doing. I asked what she meant, and Ryan told me my mother had called her parents during our junior year. My mother had suggested Ryan was a bad influence who would hold me back from my potential. Ryan's parents had told her about the call, and Ryan had tried to talk to me about it, but I'd been defensive. I remembered that conversation now. I'd told Ryan my mother was just protective. Ryan had backed off and we'd drifted apart after that. I apologized for not listening, and Ryan said she understood how hard it was to see manipulation when you're in the middle of it. Ryan said she could drive up that afternoon, and I felt tears starting but held them back. Oliver left for work, and I sat alone in his apartment looking at job listings on my phone. Ryan showed up 3 hours later with 2 bags full of clothes and toiletries, and a fierce hug that made me start crying for the first time since leaving the church. She held me while I sobbed and didn't try to make me stop or tell me it would be okay. When I finally calmed down, Ryan made tea and told me about 2 other friends from college. Sarah had transferred schools junior year, and I'd always thought it was for academic reasons. Ryan said my mother had called Sarah's parents too with concerns about Sarah's influence on me. Jessica had stopped returning my calls senior year, and I'd assumed she was busy. Ryan said my mother had spread rumors about Jessica to other parents in our social circle. I was starting to see the full scope of how my mother had isolated me from anyone she couldn't control. Ryan helped me make a list of everything I needed to do. First was opening a new bank account my mother couldn't access. Then we needed to update all my passwords and security settings. Ryan worked in tech and knew exactly what to look for. She pulled up my email settings on her laptop and found evidence that my mother had been monitoring everything for years. There were family sharing settings I didn't even know were active. My mother could see every email I sent and received. Ryan showed me the access logs, and I felt sick seeing how many times my mother had logged into my accounts. She'd been reading my private messages with friends. She'd seen every email I sent to Oliver over the years. Ryan locked down everything and created new passwords my mother couldn't guess. I started applying for jobs online, but my resume looked pathetic on the screen. I'd only worked at my father's company doing vague consulting work that was really just a salary to keep me dependent. Ryan sat next to me and helped me reframe my experience into actual skills. She turned my attendance at fundraisers into event planning experience. She made my work with charity boards sound like project management. But we both knew it was going to be hard to find something that paid enough to live on without my family connections opening doors. I sent out applications anyway because I needed to feel like I was doing something. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. It was Will, Richard's best friend. He asked if we could meet for coffee, and I felt nervous but curious enough to agree. Ryan drove me to the coffee shop and waited in the car. Will was already there at a corner table looking uncomfortable. No. He said Richard was handling the canceled wedding better than expected. Richard's parents were furious, but Richard himself seemed almost relieved. Will said Richard had been having doubts too, but didn't know how to escape the pressure. I asked what he meant, and Will leaned forward with his voice dropping low. My mother and Richard's mother had been planning our marriage since we met at that fundraiser. They'd had detailed discussions about combining family businesses and political influence. Richard had overheard his parents talking about it months ago. He'd realized he was as trapped as I was, but didn't know how to escape without destroying his family relationships. Will said Richard wanted me to know he understood why I left, and he didn't blame me. I thanked Will for telling me and drove back to Oliver's apartment feeling like the world was even more manipulated than I'd thought. Ryan had found a family lawyer named Bethany who specialized in cases like mine. We met with Bethany that afternoon in her small office downtown. Bethany reviewed the contract Oliver had received plus all the documentation of my mother's threats and manipulation. She spread the papers across her desk and read through everything carefully. Bethany said the contract was potentially evidence of extortion and intentional interference with relationships. It was complicated because Oliver did accept the money, but the pattern of threats against his father's business strengthened a case for coercion. Bethany asked detailed questions about my mother's control over the years. She took notes about every instance I could remember of my mother pushing people away or manipulating situations. Then Bethany asked about my trust fund. She wanted to see the original trust documents to determine if my mother was overstepping her authority as trustee. I realized I didn't even know the details of my own trust fund. I'd always just accepted what my mother told me about it. Bethany said that was common in cases of financial control. She explained that my mother cutting me off might actually be illegal depending on how the trust was structured. I needed to get copies of the original documents from my grandmother's lawyer. Bethany gave me a list of information to gather and said we'd meet again once I had everything. The consultation cost $200, and I paid with the last of the cash in my purse. Oliver came home from work that evening exhausted and covered in grime from crawling under a house to fix pipes. He went straight to the shower, and I could hear the water running for a long time. I felt guilty that he was working this hard while I sat unemployed in his apartment. But I also felt admiration for how he never complained about the physical labor or the long hours. When Oliver came out in clean clothes, we made dinner together in his tiny kitchen. It was the first normal moment we'd had since everything happened. Just cooking pasta and talking about his day like regular people instead of people in crisis. Oliver told me about the broken pipe he'd fixed, and the elderly woman who'd tried to pay him in homemade cookies. I told him about meeting with Bethany and what she'd said about the trust fund. We ate at his small table, and I realized this simple dinner felt more real than any of the elaborate meals at my mother's house. Oliver reached across the table and took my hand. He said we'd figure everything out one step at a time. I believed him because I had to believe in something. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still on Oliver's couch wrapped in his spare blanket. My father's name showed on the screen, and I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. His voice came through tired and worn down in a way I'd never heard before. He said my mother was making calls to everyone she knew and burning bridges left and right. She'd already contacted the building owner where Oliver's father ran his plumbing business to discuss supposed lease violations that didn't exist. My father said he was trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen to him either, and was acting like a woman possessed. I asked him why he let her control my entire life like this, and the line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he admitted he took the path of least resistance for years, because it was easier than standing up to her, and that was wrong. He said he was sorry, but the word felt hollow after 25 years of letting her manipulate everything. I thanked him for calling and hung up before he could say anything else that might make me feel worse. 2 hours later, my phone rang again, and this time it was Isabella from HR at my father's company. She used that careful professional voice people use when delivering bad news and told me my position had been eliminated due to restructuring. We both knew what that meant without saying it out loud. My mother had forced them to fire me. Isabella sounded genuinely sorry about it and said quietly that she'd seen my mother push out other employees over the years who didn't fall in line with what she wanted. She offered to serve as a reference for other jobs if I needed one who wasn't connected to my family. I wrote down her personal cell number and thanked her for being honest about what was really happening. Ryan helped me update my resume that afternoon, and we worked on reframing my vague consulting role into actual marketable skills. She made it sound better than it was, but we both knew I was reaching. I applied to 6 marketing firms and got 1 call back within 2 days. The interview was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I borrowed Ryan's navy blazer and gray pants because all my professional clothes were still at my mother's house. Ryan drilled me with practice questions about campaign management and client relations and social media strategy. I tried to sound confident, but my answers felt thin and unconvincing, even to me. The interview took place in a glass office building downtown, and the woman across the desk was maybe 30 with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. She asked about my experience managing client accounts, and I described projects I'd supposedly led at my father's company. But when she pressed for specifics about metrics and outcomes and team structures, I stumbled. She asked what software platforms I used, and I named ones I'd heard of but never actually touched. The interview lasted 20 minutes instead of the scheduled hour, and she thanked me for coming in with a tone that meant don't call us. I walked back to Oliver's apartment in Ryan's borrowed clothes, feeling like a fraud who'd just proven she had no real skills or value. Oliver found me an hour later sitting on his bathroom floor crying with my back against the tub. He didn't ask what happened right away, just sat down next to me on the cold tile. I told him I was useless because I'd never actually earned anything in my life and didn't know how to do real work. Everything on my resume was inflated or made up, and the interviewer saw through it immediately. Oliver was quiet for a minute and then said that learning to stand on your own was hard, but that didn't make me useless. He said he watched me walk away from everything I knew, and that took more courage than most people ever showed in their entire lives. I wanted to believe him, but the failed interview felt like proof that my mother was right about me being unable to survive without her money. Ryan came over that evening with her laptop and pulled up a certification program in digital marketing that I could do online. The course cost $800 and would take 3 months to complete, but it would give me actual credentials instead of fake experience. I said I couldn't afford it right now, and Ryan said she'd front me the money as a loan. I tried to refuse because Oliver was already letting me live in his apartment without paying rent, but Ryan insisted. She transferred the money right there and enrolled me in the course that started immediately. Having something productive to focus on made me feel slightly less worthless. And 3 days later, I was working through the first module of the marketing course when I heard a car door slam outside. I looked out Oliver's window and saw my mother getting out of her black Mercedes. She stood on the sidewalk staring up at the building like she couldn't believe I actually lived here above a hardware store. Oliver came to stand next to me and asked if I wanted him to go down and tell her to leave. I shook my head because I knew I had to face her eventually, and putting it off would only make it harder. I went downstairs in Oliver's oversized sweatshirt and old jeans with my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. My mother looked at me like I was homeless standing there on the cracked sidewalk with no makeup and unwashed hair. She said I looked terrible and asked how long I planned to keep up this ridiculous act. I told her I was exactly where I chose to be and this wasn't an act. She said I was throwing away my entire future for a man who made less than our gardener. She asked if I really understood that love didn't pay bills or maintain social standing or give me the life I deserved. I said the life she wanted for me wasn't one I could live anymore. My mother's expression shifted and she tried a different approach with her voice going softer. She said she would restore my trust fund and forget this whole thing happened if I came home right now. We could tell everyone the wedding was postponed due to cold feet, and Richard's family was willing to wait a few months. She made it sound so reasonable, like she was offering me a simple solution to a temporary problem. I asked her if she even heard herself talking, and if she understood that I was a person, and not a chess piece she could move around a board. She looked genuinely confused, like she couldn't understand why I was upset about her helping me have a successful life. I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo of the contract Oliver had kept. I told her I knew about all 12 years of payments and threats and manipulation. Her face went cold and still as she realized Oliver had evidence of everything she'd done. She said I was being dramatic, and that she did what any good mother would do to protect her daughter from making a life-destroying mistake. She said someday when I was older I would understand she was right about everything. I told her I would never forgive her for stealing 12 years of my life. She said I was selfish and ungrateful, and I would regret this when I was struggling to pay rent in Oliver's tiny apartment. Then she got back in her Mercedes and drove away without looking back. I made it upstairs to Oliver's apartment before my chest started tightening. My breath came in short gasps that wouldn't slow down no matter how hard I tried. The room started spinning and I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. Oliver grabbed my shoulders and pulled me down to sit on the floor. He held me while I hyperventilated and cried because the reality of what I'd lost and what I was facing crashed over me all at once. He didn't try to fix it or tell me everything would be okay. He just stayed with me on the floor until I could breathe normally again. His hand rubbed circles on my back, and somehow that simple action was exactly what I needed. I spent the next 2 days watching Oliver leave for work at 6 in the morning and come home at 7 at night, and each time he walked through the door, I felt the weight of what my choice was costing him. He never complained about working overtime to cover the legal consultation fee we'd already paid, but I saw how his shoulders slumped when he thought I wasn't looking. My phone stayed mostly silent after I blocked my mother's number, though texts from Richard's mother and various family friends kept trickling through asking if I was okay and suggesting I needed professional help. Ryan came over with takeout on the third evening and found me sitting on Oliver's couch staring at my laptop screen where I'd been pretending to work on the marketing certification for 3 hours without actually absorbing anything. She set down the food and pulled out her phone to show me a number. Bethany wanted to talk about the trust fund, and my stomach dropped because I knew what that conversation would mean. I called from Oliver's tiny kitchen while he and Ryan ate in the living room, and Bethany's voice was all business as she explained what she'd found in the trust documents my grandmother had created 20 years ago. The trust specified that the funds became mine at age 25, with very limited exceptions for restriction, and my mother's position as trustee didn't give her the right to cut off access because I made a life choice she disagreed with. Bethany laid out the legal framework in language I barely understood, but the core message was clear enough. My grandmother had protected me from exactly this situation, and my mother was breaking the rules. Bethany said we could file a lawsuit to force restoration of access, and the case was strong enough that we'd probably win. I thanked her and hung up, then stood in the kitchen feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump. Oliver appeared in the doorway and asked what Bethany had said, and I told him everything while he leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. He didn't offer advice or push me either direction, just listened while I talked through all the reasons this felt impossible. Suing my own mother meant crossing a line I could never uncross, burning a bridge that was already damaged beyond recognition, and making our family war a matter of public record. But Bethany's words kept echoing in my head about how my grandmother had intended that money for me, and my mother was stealing it by abusing her trustee position. Ryan came into the kitchen and said she'd been listening from the living room, and she pointed out that my mother had already crossed every possible line by manipulating my entire romantic life for 12 years. Oliver finally spoke and said it was my choice completely, but that maybe it was time to stop protecting my mother from consequences when she'd never protected me from anything except the life I actually wanted. I made the decision standing in that cramped kitchen with cheap linoleum under my feet and the smell of Chinese takeout in the air, and I told them yes. We filed the lawsuit the next morning at Bethany's office, and I signed papers that made my stomach hurt while she explained the process and timeline. My mother would be served with the complaint within 48 hours, and then we'd wait for her response while the court system ground forward at its typical pace. I felt sick leaving the courthouse, and Oliver held my hand in the parking lot while I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. We got home that evening to find an email from my mother's lawyer already waiting, which seemed impossible given that she shouldn't have been served yet, but apparently my mother had anticipated this move and prepared her response in advance. The email contained a countersuit against Oliver for extortion, claiming he had manipulated me into leaving Richard specifically to gain access to my trust fund money. Bethany called within an hour of me forwarding her the documents, and her voice was tight with anger as she explained that the claim was completely baseless and clearly meant to intimidate us. But it worked because Oliver went pale reading through the allegations that painted him as a gold digger who'd spent 12 years planning to steal my inheritance. He paced the apartment for an hour talking about how he couldn't afford a lawyer to defend himself, and how this kind of accusation could destroy his reputation in the community, where his father's business operated. I tried to calm him down by pointing out that Bethany said the case had no merit, but Oliver kept circling back to the legal fees and the potential damage even if we won. His father called the next morning while Oliver was at a job site, and I answered his phone without thinking because I saw the name on the screen. Oliver's dad asked for his son in a voice that sounded strained, and I told him Oliver would call back during his lunch break. He said to tell Oliver that my mother's lawyer had contacted the building owner about code violations at the plumbing business, and that an inspector was coming next week to do a full review that would probably result in expensive fines even if everything was up to standard. I felt my chest tighten as he explained that inspections like this could cost thousands in fixes and fees, and that he'd operated for 12 years without problems until now. Oliver came home that afternoon and I had to tell him about the call, and he listened with his jaw clenched before walking to the bedroom and punching the wall hard enough to leave a dent. I followed him and found him sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand bleeding slightly from split knuckles, and the look on his face made me want to take back every choice I'd made since stepping out of that wedding dress. My decision to be with him was costing his family everything exactly like my mother had threatened all those years ago, and I was watching it happen in real time. I grabbed his hand to look at the damage and told him maybe we should stop this whole thing, that I couldn't watch my mother destroy his family just to punish me for choosing him. Oliver pulled his hand back and said no with a force that surprised me, and he stood up to face me directly. He said if we backed down now, my mother won, and she'd control both of us forever, that we'd spend the rest of our lives wondering what if and living under her threats. I knew he was right, but I hated that his father's business was collateral damage in my mother's war against my independence, and I told him so while trying not to cry. We sat on the bed together, not talking for a long time, and eventually Oliver said we needed to keep going because the alternative was worse than whatever my mother could do to us. Ryan called that evening and said she'd been thinking about our situation, and she knew a journalist who covered stories about family coercion and financial abuse for a major publication. The journalist's name was something I didn't catch because I was too busy feeling my stomach drop at the suggestion of going public with my mother's manipulation. Ryan explained that this journalist had helped other people expose similar patterns of control, and that my story with the documented contract could help people recognize when they were being manipulated by family members. I thought about my mother's signature on that contract, admitting to 12 years of payments and threats, and I imagined it printed in an article that thousands of people would read. The idea made me feel exposed and vulnerable, but Ryan pointed out that my mother's power came from operating in private, where no one could see what she was doing. Going public would strip away that privacy and potentially stop her from doing this to anyone else, but it would also mean burning bridges permanently and exposing family business that some people would say should stay private. I told Ryan I needed to think about it, and she said the journalist was willing to meet with me whenever I was ready to talk. I spent the next day considering whether I wanted to take that step, looking at the contract Oliver had kept, and imagining it reproduced in print. Bethany called that afternoon, and I told her about the journalist offer, and she was quiet for a moment before saying that sometimes the threat of publicity was more powerful than actually going public. She explained that we had enough evidence for the trust fund case without media involvement, and that my mother might back down if she knew we were considering exposing her. I decided against the journalist for now because I wasn't ready for that level of public exposure, but I kept the option available if my mother escalated further. Oliver came home exhausted that night and found me looking at retail job postings online, and he asked what I was doing with an edge in his voice. I told him I needed to get any job immediately, instead of waiting to finish the marketing certification, and he said I was panicking and making short-term decisions that would hurt my long-term prospects. I snapped that he didn't understand what it felt like to be completely useless and dependent while watching his family suffer. Because of me, and Oliver's face went hard. He said he'd spent 12 years feeling worthless because my mother paid him to believe he wasn't good enough for me. So actually, he understood perfectly what it felt like to have someone make you feel less than human. We stared at each other across the small living room, and I realized this was our first real fight since everything had happened. I apologized first because he was right that I was panicking, and Oliver sat down next to me on the couch looking tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He admitted he was scared that I would resent him when the reality of a modest life fully hit me, that I'd miss the country clubs and luxury and eventually blame him for everything I'd lost. I told him I was scared too. Scared I'd fail at building an independent life and prove my mother right about me being helpless without her money. But I said I'd rather fail trying to be authentic than succeed at being controlled, and Oliver pulled me close while we both sat with our fears. The marketing certification course kept me busy over the next week, and I actually started understanding the material now that I could focus without the constant panic. I applied to 3 entry-level marketing positions at small agencies, and one of them called me back for an interview that went better than the first disaster. The agency owner was a woman in her 40s who'd built her business from nothing, and she asked me direct questions about why my resume was so thin and why I was starting over at my age. I told her an edited version of the truth about leaving a family business to build something independent, and she seemed to respect the honesty. She called 2 days later with an offer for an entry-level position making $35,000 a year, which was less than I used to spend on clothes in a single year, but felt like winning the lottery. I accepted immediately and told her I could start in 2 weeks, which would give me time to finish the first module of my certification course. Oliver came home that night to find me actually smiling for the first time in weeks, and I told him about the job while he picked me up and spun me around in the tiny kitchen. We celebrated with cheap wine and pizza, and for one evening the weight of legal battles and family destruction lifted enough that we could just be happy about something good happening. My father called 3 days after I started my certification course and asked if we could meet for lunch without telling my mother. I agreed and picked a diner 40 minutes from both our houses, somewhere neutral where nobody would recognize us. He walked in looking smaller than I remembered. His shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something heavy, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into permanent creases. We sat across from each other in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, and he ordered coffee he didn't drink while I watched him struggle to find words. He finally said my mother had become obsessed with fixing the situation and spent hours every day on the phone with her lawyer planning new strategies to force me back. She refused to accept that I wasn't coming home and kept telling everyone at the country club that I was going through a phase and would come to my senses soon. His voice cracked when he admitted their marriage was falling apart because he was tired of her controlling behavior, but didn't know how to stand up to her after 30 years of going along with everything she wanted. I asked him why he never stopped her from manipulating my life, and he stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before saying he took the easy path, and that was unforgivable. He looked at me with red eyes and said he was proud of me for being braver than he ever was, and I realized my father had been trapped too, just in a different cage than mine. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, his palm rough and warm, and told me he was going to testify in the trust fund case if Bethany needed him. He said he knew my grandmother wanted me to have that money, and my mother was wrong to withhold it out of spite. His voice got stronger as he talked, and he explained that he couldn't openly defy my mother in most things, because he didn't have the strength for constant battles, but he could do this one thing to help me even if it meant facing her anger. I squeezed his hand and thanked him, and we sat there for another hour talking about nothing important, just the weather and his garden and my certification course, like we were normal people having a normal lunch. When we left, he hugged me in the parking lot and whispered that he loved me and he was sorry, and I watched him drive away in the car my mother had picked out for him 5 years ago. The trust fund hearing happened 6 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. My grandmother's lawyer, who had set up the original trust 20 years ago, testified first, an older woman with sharp eyes who brought copies of every document. She explained that my grandmother had been very specific about the terms, and my mother was clearly violating them by cutting off my access for personal reasons rather than the legal causes listed in the trust agreement. She pointed out that the trust-specified funds could only be restricted for criminal activity, declared mental incompetence by a licensed psychiatrist, or substance abuse issues, and refusing to marry someone my mother approved of wasn't on that list. My mother's lawyer argued that I was mentally unstable and making poor decisions that proved I couldn't handle money responsibly, and he tried to paint me as someone having a breakdown who needed protection from myself. Bethany stood up with a folder full of evidence and presented documentation of my new job, my completed certification modules, my stable living situation with rent paid on time, and character references from my boss and Ryan. She systematically destroyed every claim of instability with facts and dates and proof that I was functioning perfectly well without my mother's control. My mother sat at her lawyer's table in a designer suit that cost more than Oliver made in a month, and stared straight ahead without looking at me once. The judge was a woman in her 60s who listened to everything with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. She asked my mother's lawyer specific questions about the evidence of my supposed instability, and he stumbled through answers that didn't hold up under scrutiny. She asked Bethany about my employment and living situation, and Bethany provided clear, detailed responses with supporting documentation. Then the judge turned to my mother and asked her directly why she believed withholding the trust fund was appropriate, and my mother said in a tight voice that she was protecting me from making mistakes I would regret. The judge asked what mistakes specifically, and my mother said choosing to live in poverty with someone unsuitable instead of accepting the life she had worked hard to provide. The judge's expression shifted slightly, and she asked if by unsuitable my mother meant someone from a lower economic class, and my mother's lawyer jumped in to say that wasn't what she meant, but the damage was done. The judge ruled in my favor and ordered my mother to restore my trust fund access within 30 days. She also criticized my mother's abuse of her trustee position and said she was seriously considering appointing an independent trustee to prevent future manipulation of the trust terms. My mother's face went white, and her lawyer started talking about appeals, but the judge cut him off and said the ruling was final, unless my mother wanted to face additional sanctions for contempt. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I just felt hollow because I had just legally battled my own mother in court and won, which meant whatever relationship we had left was probably destroyed forever. Bethany gathered her papers and squeezed my shoulder and told me we had done the right thing, but right didn't make it hurt less. 2 weeks after the trust fund hearing, my mother's countersuit against Oliver got dismissed in a separate proceeding. The judge reviewed all the evidence and noted that my mother had no proof of extortion, and that her own contract proved she was the one making threats and payments over 12 years. He said the case was frivolous and bordered on harassment, and he warned my mother's lawyer that filing baseless suits to intimidate people could result in sanctions against him personally. Oliver sat next to me in the courtroom, and I felt his whole body relax when the judge announced the dismissal, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. But after we left the courthouse, he showed me the bill from his lawyer, and it was $3,000 he didn't have, money he'd put on a credit card that would take him months to pay off. I promised to pay him back once I had trust fund access, but he shook his head and said we were in this together, and money didn't matter compared to being free of my mother's threats. I started my new job on a Monday morning in September, and it was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. The office was small with 10 people total, and I was clearly the lowest person in the hierarchy, the one everyone else could assign tasks to without question. I spent my first week getting coffee for meetings, making copies, organizing files, and doing basic data entry while people younger than me gave me assignments and checked my work. The other junior account coordinator was 23 and had been there for a year, and she showed me the systems with patient explanations like I was a child learning something simple. I had to ask questions about things everyone else knew and admit I didn't understand processes that were apparently obvious to normal people who had worked real jobs before. But I showed up early and stayed late, and did every task as well as I could, and by the end of the second week my boss pulled me aside and said I was a quick learner, and she was impressed with my work ethic. For the first time in my life, I was earning something based on my own actual work, rather than my family name or my mother's connections, and that felt worth more than the salary. Oliver's father called me directly 3 weeks after my mother's lawsuit got dismissed, and his voice was warm in a way I hadn't heard before. He said the building inspection had happened, and they'd survived with only minor fines for some outdated electrical outlets that needed updating. The building owner had admitted to him privately that my mother had pressured him hard to find major violations that would shut down the business, but he couldn't manufacture problems that didn't exist without risking his own license. Oliver's father thanked me for standing up to my mother because he'd spent 12 years afraid of her threats, walking on eggshells and taking her payments to Oliver because he didn't know how else to protect his family. He said now that she'd lost her power over us, she'd lost her power over him too, and he felt like he could finally breathe normally. He invited Oliver and me to Sunday dinner at his house and said he wanted to get to know me properly, not as the rich girl his son loved from a distance, but as the woman who chose his son over everything else. My mother made one final attempt at contact through an email that arrived late on a Thursday night. The subject line said, "From your mother," like I might have forgotten who she was, and the message was 3 pages long. It started with accusations about how I'd betrayed the family and destroyed her reputation at the club, and made her the subject of gossip among everyone she knew. It went through a list of everything she'd done for me over the years, every opportunity she'd provided and every door she'd opened, like I owed her my entire life in exchange for basic parenting. But toward the end, the tone shifted, and she wrote that she only wanted what was best for me, and couldn't I see that everything she did was to protect me from hardship and struggle. She said she was sorry I couldn't understand that yet, but maybe someday when I was older and wiser I would realize she had been right all along. The last line said she hoped I was happy and that she loved me even though I had hurt her deeply. I read it 3 times and felt nothing but a tired kind of sadness, because she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong and probably never would. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say that would reach her through the wall of her own certainty, and Bethany advised me to save the email in case we needed evidence of her continued attempts at manipulation. Will called me a month later with news that surprised me more than it should have. He said Richard had gotten engaged to someone he actually loved, a woman named Sarah he'd met through work rather than through family matchmaking. She was a policy analyst with no political connections or family money, just someone Richard had fallen for naturally without pressure or planning. Will said Richard seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Will had known him. Lighter somehow, like he'd been released from something heavy. I felt glad that Richard had found his own path out of the control our families had tried to impose, that he'd managed to escape his cage the same way I'd escaped mine. I sent him a brief message congratulating him and wishing him happiness, and he responded warmly, saying he hoped Oliver and I were doing well, and that he understood now why I'd run. He wrote that he'd been relieved when I didn't show up to the wedding because he'd been planning to back out himself, but didn't have the courage, so in a way, I'd saved them both from a terrible mistake. My trust fund access got restored exactly 30 days after the judge's ruling, and I logged into the account to see a balance that made my hands shake. It was enough money to be financially stable while building my career, enough to stop worrying about every dollar and whether I could afford groceries. But I was careful not to fall back into the spending habits my mother had encouraged, the mindless buying of expensive things I didn't need just because I could. I paid Oliver back for his legal fees immediately and offered to start paying rent for his apartment, but we sat down and talked about money for the first time like adults planning a future together. We decided to save most of the money for eventually getting a bigger place together, somewhere that belonged to both of us, rather than just him letting me stay in his space. Oliver said he wanted to contribute equally to our life, even though my trust fund meant I had more money, and I loved him more for caring about that kind of fairness, when plenty of people would have just taken the easy path. Trust fund money didn't change the fact that I'd spent years believing I was worthless because my mother paid the one person I loved to reject me, and no amount of financial security could erase that damage overnight. Oliver and I talked about using some of the money to take his dad out for a nice dinner to thank him for standing up to my mother's threats all those years, and we ended up at a steakhouse where Oliver's dad kept saying the prices were too high, but I could see how proud he was that his son had found happiness despite everything my mother tried to do. 6 months after the trust fund ruling, my boss called me into her office and told me they were promoting me to senior account manager with a salary of $62,000. And I sat there trying not to cry because I'd earned this through my own work, rather than having it handed to me through family connections. The promotion meant managing 3 junior account managers and handling our biggest clients, and I spent my first week in the new role, terrified I'd mess up and prove I only got there through luck. Oliver's dad called him that same week with news that the plumbing business was doing well enough to expand, and he wanted to bring Oliver on as a partner with equity and a path to eventually taking over the company. We celebrated both promotions with cheap champagne in our apartment, and Oliver kept saying he couldn't believe we were both building real careers based on our own efforts, rather than what our families handed us or took away. Ryan called me 3 months later to say she was getting married to someone she'd been dating for 2 years, and she asked if I'd be her maid of honor because I was the first person she thought of when she imagined her wedding day. I stood next to Ryan at her wedding in a dress I'd picked out myself, watching her marry someone she genuinely loved, and I kept thinking about how different my life would be if I'd married Richard like my mother planned. I'd probably be pregnant with a baby conceived for social appearances rather than love, living in a house Richard's mother helped us choose, attending political fundraisers I didn't care about and wondering why I felt so empty despite having everything money could buy. My father met me for lunch the week after Ryan's wedding and told me something that surprised me more than I expected. He said my mother had started going to therapy because their marriage counselor insisted on it as a condition for continuing couples counseling, and that she was beginning to recognize how her need for control had damaged her relationships with everyone around her. I didn't know if she'd ever truly change, or if we'd ever repair our relationship to anything resembling normal. But I told my father I was open to the possibility someday, if she could genuinely acknowledge what she did wrong without making excuses, or blaming me for being ungrateful. 2 years after I stepped out of that wedding dress on the highway, I sat in the living room of our small house that we'd just bought with our combined savings and a modest mortgage. Oliver was in the kitchen making dinner while I finished a work presentation on my laptop, and this simple Tuesday evening was everything I didn't know I needed when I was planning a wedding to someone I didn't love. I chose freedom over comfort, authentic love over social status, and a modest life I built myself over a gilded cage someone else constructed for their own purposes. I'd never been happier or more proud of who I'd become than I was sitting there in sweatpants with my husband cooking pasta in our tiny kitchen while I worked on a presentation I'd created entirely on my own merit.